Again, we're taking a live look at the condo building that collapsed last week in Surfside, Florida. The search for survivors now in day 6. Of course, we wanted to talk about the mental health impacts of such a tragic event like this. So currently joining us is stress coach and psychologist Dr. Terry Lyles to talk about this. Good morning, Dr. Lyles. How are you doing? And thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. I'm doing great and looking forward to our discussion.
So I wanted to ask you, when you have such a major tragic event like this that has not just, been felt here on the East Coast or nationwide, but worldwide, people are paying attention to this story. What should people do when they first realize what has happened, when they first digest the news?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I did work at 9/11 in Thailand after the tsunami and, Haiti earthquake. And so I've been around the world doing this. And this sounds very interesting. I live in South Florida here, not too far from the site, and we are getting global attention. And it's because it's such a horrific event that it's quite frightening when you think about you're living in your place and the building just falls into itself. I mean, that level of fear starts rippling through people. So it causes a traumatic stress opportunity that we normally have to talk through and work through for a period of time.
Yeah, absolutely, especially because this is so sudden and there's still so many unanswered questions. We're showing the surveillance video, the one that's gotten a lot of people's attention, because they still don't know how or why this happened. So what are the first coping mechanisms that people should know about?
Grief goes in stages, typically 5 stages, some will go 7, but the first stage is shock. And it's really a good thing because chemically it numbs us. It gives us the ability to look through things and see things more numb, and it helps us get through crisis. It's actually a great chemical in our body that helps us do that. But then when that shock begins to wear off after days or weeks, depending on how this thing unfolds, the next thing's going to happen is this, this guilt. I should have been there. I should have known. I should have called yesterday. So there's a cycle and a series that goes through. But the first level is shock. There's people shocked all over the world that a building could just fall down on a beach. So that process has to be, drawn through. And when there's survivors, that are unaccounted for, that makes it even more of a trauma event because you can't get your mind around it psychologically without seeing a body and help start that grieving process.
We've actually been showing footage on the left-hand side of the screen of a vigil that was being held for the now 11 victims that have already been announced. Of course, people are hoping for the best, but kind of preparing for the worst, feeling that more victims are going to be found and identified. But when we're talking about the people who are actually responding to the scene, the first responders, they're trained to deal with emergencies. Mental health experts say nothing can truly prepare them psychologically. How could this take a toll on them in the moment and even in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great observation because my first traumatic event like that, serving like that, was at 9/11, and I had never been to anything that devastating. There was 16 blocks of devastation, and for months we were going back and forth, and I didn't realize how it was even affecting me for the first week or so. And you can't prepare for this. You're exactly right. When you've done enough of them, you still don't prepare correctly because it brings back all the other trauma that you've suffered in your life. So they have to be recovering, and I write about this a lot, that recovery is the key mechanism to any kind of trauma relief. Making sure when they're doing those 12-hour shifts, if you're digging through that rubble, making sure that you're drinking plenty of water, that you're, talking to people, that you're doing your job, but then you're trying to make sure you get rest and sleep. About every 2 hours, you need a quick 2 to 5 minute break. It could be stand up, sit down. The recovery system is so powerful to keep us level. If not, our emotions get flat, our thoughts get flat, and then our body runs out of energy, and then we can go into more of a traumatic kind of event in ourselves, which we want to avoid.
Dr. Lyles, if you wouldn't mind discussing, please, many people both directly and indirectly are impacted by this tragedy, but now they're dealing with the stress of the unknown. I mean, we just showed a report from Fox 35 Orlando that said, hey, if you're thinking about buying a condominium now, you might want to look into the building history, the maintenance, the repair that's been done, and all that jazz. Is that a natural response to something like this?
Absolutely. I mean, if you remember, again, I go back to 9/11. I mean, the first flight I was on, there were 6 people on the, 727. I mean, it makes you rethink, why shouldn't I just drive? We were flying into other airports and then getting munitions going in and doing what we had to do. So Yeah, people buying condos or even a hotel on the beach staying. I mean, we stay in hotels up and down the beach for business. And, it makes you think if you're on a floor and you're on the beach and close to that area, how do you know? So it does bring up a different check system within ourselves. But again, do the research. Information is power, and it'll give us at least some sense of security, even though it may not be infallible, but at least it can give you a more of a security check on where am I staying, where am I buying, and what are the plans going forward to make sure you're doing the best you can for you and your family.
For those directly impacted, the victims' families dealing with grief and disaster, how do they go about that?
You just hang on at first. I mean, you're still hopeful. You don't want to lose hope. I love the word hope. If you take the E off, it means hop, which means to elevate. You have to stay elevated. You have to keep believing. That's where our faith comes in, and support, and chaplains, clergy, the neighborhood pulling together, the fence you saw there with people putting their photos on becomes a visual site. I've seen this in disaster zones around the world, and it helps. It's a rallying point for people to share their hope and comfort together. Very important that they talk to each other, that they hold on together. And as this thing unfolds, there'll be different levels of grief when the shock begins to wear off. Then they can go through that process. I actually have a free giveaway manual that we use as a PDF download, and it's Caught in Nature's Path. And it's when things like this happen and how do you matriculate through it. So it takes time, but this first stage is the most difficult because of the uncertainty.
I was just about to ask you, do you have any books or resources that people can look into, websites to try to deal with this?
Sure. Yeah, I've written 4 books on this. Actually, each book was dedicated to a different disaster. My latest one's called Performance Under Pressure. And, it's how do we deal with this? Whether you're a first responder, whether you're a CEO, a stay-home mom, we're all performing. But the giveaway is on my website at terrylyles.com, TerryLyles.com. And it's Caught in Nature's Path. And it's just a free PDF download. You can download it and send it to anybody. And we do that with my publisher, Southwestern Speakers, because we want to help communities find hope in the midst of these kind of tragedies. And we feel like we've been called for such a time as this, once again, unfortunately, but it happens.
One more thing I wanted to ask you, in terms of mental health check, I feel like it's finally becoming a more widely discussed topic. Your mental health is just as important as your physical health. What can people do on a day-to-day? How do they do a mental health check just to make sure that everything's okay?
The one way you can check very simply is by checking on your concentration, your focus level. Many times when things like this happen, we get really, confused. We may not be able, it's almost like an ADD effect, attention deficit. We're kind of bouncing around. We need a good support system. So go through those mental checks of how am I concentrating today? Am I allowing my mind to think about the good things? What am I grateful for today? Even in the midst of tragedy. I used to ask children this for weeks at a time in Thailand who lost all their families, and they were in villages and makeshift camps. And we would go through exercises and talk about what are you grateful for? And some would say, how can you be grateful in the midst of this? You have to find ways. I'm breathing, I'm alive, I got the rest of my family with me. So those mental recovery breaks feed our mind, our body, and our souls to keep hopeful in the midst of these kind of crises that, sometimes seems like they're never going to end.
You've mentioned the word hope a lot during this interview. We're now in day 6 of the search for survivors. You think everybody should keep holding on to hope?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You do it until there's nothing else to do. Because, what's the obvious? I call that a threat challenge response. The threat is we won't find our loved ones. The challenge is we still could. That's why those first responders are digging and pulling 12-hour shifts, literally hand by hand, because they have hope. So just know that hope exists. Out of faith, hope, and love, hope is the center. So I commonly say, if we have paint, that's our faith. I put the paint on the canvas, which is our hope, and the final product or the actual portrait is the love response that we have for ourselves, our community, and for those that are working so tirelessly to try to get a great result out of something horrific.
Is there anything else that I didn't get to ask you that you'd like to tell our viewers?
No, I'm good. You had great questions.
All right, Dr. Terry Lyles, stress coach and psychologist, we really appreciate your time this morning here on NewsNOW from Fox.
Thank you.
Taking a live look now, everybody, at a gorgeous view. The sunrise in Port Canaveral, Florida. We're talking about hope. We're talking about light. We're talking about happiness. Hopefully that brings you a little bit of peace today. This is News Now from Fox. We'll be back in 2 minutes.